NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a group of countries in North America and Europe. NATO was created after the Second World War in 1949. At that time, many countries were worried about the Soviet Union. NATO was formed as a promise between countries to protect each other. The main idea of NATO is collective defense. This means if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will help to defend it. This important promise is known as Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Article 5 says, "An attack on one is an attack on all." NATO has grown since it started. More countries have joined over time. It is seen as an important organization for keeping peace and security in the world. However, there are discussions about the future of NATO. One important question is the role of the United States in NATO. The United States is a powerful member of NATO. In the past, President Trump raised questions about the U.S. commitment to NATO. He suggested that the U.S. might not defend countries that do not spend enough money on their own defense. This has led to discussions about whether the U.S. might reduce its involvement in NATO or even leave the alliance. Changes in NATO could have big effects on global security. NATO is important for the relationship between North America and Europe. Understanding NATO, its history, and the current questions about its future is important to understand world events. 2. NATO's start and growth. NATO was created after the Second World War. Many countries in Western Europe and North America felt worried about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very powerful country with a different political system. These countries wanted to work together for their safety. On the 4th of April, 1949, 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. These original members were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The main reason for NATO was to protect its members from the threat of the Soviet Union. This period was called the Cold War. NATO was based on an idea of collective defense. This means that if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will help defend it. This idea is written in Article 5 of the treaty. Over time, more countries joined NATO. In 1952, Greece and Turkey became members. West Germany joined in 1955, and Spain in 1982. After the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke up, many countries in Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO. Starting in 1999, NATO expanded. Former Warsaw Pact countries, which were allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, joined NATO. Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined. Later, Albania and Croatia joined in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and North Macedonia in 2020. Finland became a member in 2023, and Sweden in 2024. Now, NATO has 32 member countries. At first, NATO's main job was collective defense against the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, NATO's role changed. It started to take on broader security roles. NATO became involved in peacekeeping and crisis management in places like the Balkans. After the 11th of September 2001 attacks, NATO also focused on fighting terrorism. NATO's mission has evolved from just defending against one main threat to dealing with different security challenges around the world. 3. How NATO works. NATO is a big organization with many parts that work together. It is like a team of countries. The main job of NATO is to keep its member countries safe. To do this, NATO has a structure with different groups and rules. One very important part of NATO is the North Atlantic Council, or NAC. This is where all the member countries meet to talk and make decisions. Each country sends a representative to the NAC. Big decisions in NATO are made here. For example, if NATO needs to start a new plan or operation, the NAC decides. Decisions in the NAC need to be agreed by all countries. This is called consensus. It means everyone has to say yes. The Secretary General is like the leader of NATO. They are in charge of the daily work of NATO. The Secretary General helps to chair meetings of the NAC and speaks for NATO to the world. They also help to make sure that all countries are working together. NATO also has a military structure. This structure helps NATO to plan and carry out military actions if needed. The military committee is made up of the top military leaders from each member country. They give advice to the NAC on military matters. There are two main military commands in NATO. Allied Command Operations, ACO, is responsible for NATO's military operations around the world. Allied Command Transformation, ACT, works to improve NATO's military forces for the future. Article 5 is a very important rule in NATO. It is about collective defense. It says that if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will help. It is like saying an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 has only been used one time. This was after the attacks on the United States on the 11th of September, 2001. NATO is paid for by its member countries. Each country gives money to NATO. There are direct contributions, which are payments to common NATO funds. Countries also make indirect contributions by paying for their own armies and equipment. NATO has a target for how much money member countries should spend on defense. This target is 2% of a country's GDP, which is the total value of goods and services produced in a country each year. NATO asks countries to try to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. This money helps to keep NATO strong and ready to protect its members. 4. The USA in NATO. The United States was one of the 12 countries that started NATO in 1949. NATO was created after the Second World War to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union. From the beginning, the USA has been a very important leader in NATO. It is the most powerful country in the alliance and has the biggest economy. The USA spends more money on its military than any other NATO member. The USA has always provided a lot of soldiers and military equipment to NATO. For many years, there have been American soldiers based in Europe. This presence shows America's commitment to defend Europe. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty says that if one member is attacked, all members will help. This promise of collective defense is very important. When the USA was attacked on the 11th of September, 2001, NATO used Article 5 for the first time. NATO countries, including the USA, worked together in Afghanistan after these attacks. However, sometimes there are discussions about how much each country in NATO should pay for defense. This is called burden sharing. The USA has often said that other NATO countries should spend more on their own defense. NATO set a goal for each country to spend 2% of their money, GDP, on defense. For a long time, the USA was one of the few countries that spent this much. In recent years, some U.S. leaders have talked more about this issue. President Trump, for example, said that the USA was paying too much for NATO and that other countries were not paying their fair share. He questioned if the USA should always defend countries that do not spend enough on defense. He even suggested that the USA might not help if some NATO countries were attacked. This was a change from the usual U.S. position on NATO. President Trump said he was not sure if other NATO countries would help the USA if it was in trouble. He mentioned France and other countries, saying he was not certain they would protect the USA. However, Article 5 of NATO has been used, and NATO countries did support the USA after 9/11s. France's President Macron responded by saying that France and the USA have a long history of helping each other, going back centuries. He mentioned historical figures and events to show this long friendship and alliance. Despite these discussions, the USA is still officially committed to NATO. The person chosen to be the U.S. ambassador to NATO said that the U.S. commitment to NATO was very strong. NATO's leader also said that more and more NATO countries are now spending the agreed 2% on defense. He even said that President Trump's comments had encouraged some countries to spend more. The USA continues to be a central part of NATO, but there are ongoing conversations about how the costs and responsibilities of the alliance should be shared. 5. Problems inside NATO. NATO is a group of many countries. Like any group, sometimes there are problems inside NATO. These problems are usually disagreements between the countries. One problem is about money. NATO asks each country to spend a certain amount of money on defense. This amount is 2% of their money they make as a country each year. However, not all countries spend this much. Some countries spend less than 2%. This makes other countries unhappy, especially the United States. The United States spends a lot of money on NATO. Some people in the U.S. think that other countries should pay more. They say it is not fair that the U.S. pays so much and other countries pay less. They think if some countries do not pay enough, the U.S. should not protect them if they are attacked. This is a big disagreement about sharing the cost of NATO. Another problem is that countries may see threats differently. Some countries might think one thing is dangerous, while other countries think something else is more important. For example, some countries might worry more about Russia. Other countries might worry more about problems in other parts of the world, like terrorism. Because of these different ideas, countries in NATO may not always agree on what to do. Sometimes what is good for one country is not good for another country. Each country has its own ideas and plans. They want to do what is best for them. Sometimes this can cause problems inside NATO. For example, one country might want NATO to do one thing, but another country does not agree because it is not good for their own country. Events in the world can also cause problems in NATO. For example, when there was a war in Iraq, not all NATO countries agreed on what to do. This caused some tension inside NATO. Also, when Russia took Crimea from Ukraine, it made some countries in NATO worried and others less worried. These events can show different ideas and create disagreements. One country that sometimes has different ideas from other NATO countries is Turkey. Turkey is in a difficult place in the world and has its own problems. Sometimes Turkey does things that other NATO countries do not agree with. This can also create problems inside NATO. Even though there are problems inside NATO, the countries still work together. They talk and try to find solutions. NATO is still a strong group because the countries know it is important to work together for safety. But it is important to know that inside NATO, like in any group, there are sometimes disagreements and problems to solve. 6. Arguments for U.S. leaving. Some people suggest that the United States should leave NATO or reduce its role in the organization. They have different reasons for this idea. One main argument is about money and fairness. The United States spends a lot of money on defense compared to other NATO countries. Some think that other countries in NATO do not pay enough. They believe these countries depend too much on the U.S. to protect them. For example, there is a target for NATO members to spend 2% of their economy on defense. However, not all countries reach this target. Those who want the U.S. to leave argue that the U.S. is paying too much for the defense of richer countries in Europe. This money, they say, could be used for things in the United States instead, like schools or hospitals. Another argument is about getting involved in conflicts. NATO is an alliance, so if one member is attacked, other members are expected to help. Some people in the U.S. worry that this could pull the U.S. into wars that are not really about U.S. safety. They think that problems in Europe should be solved by Europeans, and the U.S. should not always be involved. They might point to the fact that Article 5, the collective defense part of NATO, has only been used once, after the attacks on the U.S. on the 11th of September. However, some argue that the U.S. could still be drawn into future conflicts through NATO. Furthermore, some believe that Europe is strong enough to defend itself now. After World War II, NATO was created to protect Europe from the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union does not exist anymore. Europe is now made up of strong, wealthy countries. Those who argue for the U.S. to leave NATO suggest that Europe should take more responsibility for its own defense. They think European countries should spend more on their own armies and not rely so much on the United States. Finally, the United States has changing priorities. Some believe that the U.S. should focus more on other parts of the world, like Asia, where new challenges are growing. They argue that the main focus of U.S. foreign policy should shift away from Europe and towards these new areas. Staying heavily involved in NATO, they say, takes attention and resources away from these more important priorities for the U.S. in the 21st century. In conclusion, there are several arguments for the United States to leave or reduce its involvement in NATO. These arguments are based on financial costs, the risk of getting into conflicts, the idea of European self-reliance, and changing U.S. priorities in the world. 7. Arguments for U.S. staying. There are strong reasons why the United States continues to be a key part of NATO. Staying in NATO is seen as important for keeping peace and security, not just in Europe, but also for the U.S. NATO helps to keep things stable in the world. When the U.S. is part of NATO, it sends a clear message to other countries. This message is that any attack on a NATO member is like an attack on all of them, including the United States. This idea, called Article 5, acts as a powerful way to stop conflicts from starting. If the U.S. were to leave, this deterrent effect might become weaker, and the world could become less stable. NATO is also a place where countries work together. It is a forum for discussions and making plans for shared security. The U.S. benefits from these discussions. It allows the U.S. to work with many allies on important issues, from fighting terrorism to dealing with new threats, like cyber attacks. This cooperation can make responses to global problems more effective because many countries are involved. Furthermore, NATO is important for dealing with shared dangers. Threats like terrorism and attacks in cyberspace do not respect borders. NATO provides a structure for countries to work together to face these threats. The U.S., by staying in NATO, can pool resources and share information with allies to better protect itself and others from these dangers. NATO's operations, such as those after the attacks on the 11th of September, show how the alliance can act together when facing a major threat. Leaving NATO could have negative effects. Without the U.S., European security could be weakened. This could lead to instability in Europe, which could in turn affect the U.S. A U.S. withdrawal might also damage the global order, making it harder to deal with international problems. Many believe that U.S. leadership in NATO is vital for maintaining a strong and effective alliance. In conclusion, arguments for the U.S. staying in NATO highlight the alliance's role in maintaining security and stability NATO provides a critical deterrent against conflict, a forum for international cooperation, and a framework for addressing shared threats. Staying in NATO is seen by many as being in the best interest of the U.S., as it contributes to both transatlantic and global security. 8. What might happen? It is difficult to know exactly what will happen with NATO in the future. There are different possibilities. One possibility is that the United States might decide to reduce its role in NATO. Some people in the U.S. think that Europe should take more responsibility for its own defense. They say that the U.S. spends a lot of money on NATO and that other countries do not pay enough. If the U.S. reduces its support, NATO could become weaker. This might mean that NATO is less able to protect its members if there is a threat. Another possibility is that the U.S. might stay in NATO, but with some changes. The U.S. could ask European countries to spend more money on their armies. This is something that has been discussed for many years. If European countries spend more, it could make NATO stronger, even if the U.S. changes its approach slightly. If the U.S. were to leave NATO or significantly reduce its role, Europe might need to think about its own security in a new way. European countries might work more closely together on defense. They could create stronger European armies and make their own plans for security. This could change the balance of power in the world. It is also possible that NATO will continue as it is now. Despite some disagreements, NATO has been important for many years for security in Europe and North America. Many countries believe that it is still important to work together to face common threats. The future of NATO will depend on many things, including political changes in member countries and how global events develop. It is a complex situation with no easy answers, and different paths are possible.
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.